I'm a criminal defense lawyer with practice in Houston, Texas. I'm going to be interviewed today by my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Berryhill. Michael and I have been friends for many, many years. He's a journalist and chairman of the Texas Southern University's School of Journalism. He's a Soros Grant Award winner and the author of the Trials of Eire Brown, published by the University of Texas Press. Michael, I'm pleased that you agreed to do this interview with me today.
Well, I'm happy to do it, and over the years, of course, I got to know some of your work. And let's start out you're not an ordinary criminal defense lawyer. Explain what you do.
Well, my first 10 years of practice, I was an ordinary criminal defense lawyer. But I was one of the first of the 11 group that were employed by the Texas Department of Correction back in the very early 70s to be a public defender at the Texas prison system. I'd always had an interest in corrections law. Corrections law being that law that begins at the point of sentencing and runs through incarceration or probation and up until the termination of an imposed sentence. It includes doing a little civil rights work, doing a little administrative prison law, generally taking care of the needs of people who become inmates or probationers, parolees, and their families. Said another way, what we do is if you got to go to prison, how short a time can we help your lawyer make that be? While in prison, how comfortable can we make you when problems arise that have to be dealt with, such as medical or time credit or any number of issues that can arise? And can we help you get paroled? And then can we help you through your parole term and into the discharge of your sentence, and at times we engage in pardons work.
So you've handled some big cases, and not many lawyers understand this. My understanding too is defense lawyers hire you to handle this complicated task about parole. The law schools in Texas, unlike many in the Northeast and the Northwest, and even in Louisiana, do not have a course that deals with the issues in legal work that our firm deals with. And it's regretful. I know the fellow that teaches that course over in Louisiana, and he's a very competent guy and just busy as he can be. And at least their lawyers, when they walk out of law school, know how their parole system works, knows what the circumstances that are involved in that are, knows about the general types of prison problems that arise, or how to calculate time credit, when the people that walk out of law schools in Texas don't have the vaguest idea. I've seen lawyers been practicing criminal law 2 and 3 years that can't sit down and explain what mandatory supervision is. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about a couple of the biggest, most publicized parole cases you have, because one of the interesting things about, let's say, defendants who are convicted of notorious crimes, the pressure on the parole board is really intense. And what I'm thinking of is the cases of John Boz and Greg Hawke.
Those are two pretty interesting cases. Ott was the first one we handled. Greg Hawke was a graduate student in Denton, Texas, straight A student, working on his PhD, I believe. He lived out in the country. He did leather work. He was sort of a hippie. This was back in the very early 70s, as I recall. He had been robbed twice out there at his place. He'd usually buy a pound of weed every once in a while, and he would sell that, but use it primarily for his own use. He was not a dealer of any magnitude. One day he was approached on a 20-pound deal, and he said, "Well, I've never done a 20-pound deal." Of course, it was a snitch. They set him up, and in Denton County got him a search warrant. And then on their way out to his house, the cops stopped by a bar and stopped off for a while and had a few toddies. Now, bearing in mind this guy had been twice robbed, he had purchased a gun. By the time the cops got out in the country to where he lived and where the 20 pounds of weed was stashed in an outhouse box, or an outbuilding he had out there, they were flying pretty high, and he heard this rustling at the back door, and then he heard this banging at the front door, and he got his gun out thinking he was being robbed and shot through the door and killed a Texas Ranger. Went to trial, well tried, quite a controversial case. Among those who observed the trial was my dear friend Gary Cartwright of the Texas Monthly, who wrote a hell of an article about it in the Texas Monthly, explaining that why did this guy get a life sentence for something that surely was mitigational under the best of circumstances in light of his fairly recent history of being robbed twice. At any rate, off to prison he went. He was a model prisoner. Model prisoner. He saved the life of a couple of guards. He stopped the boiler room explosion from happening one time. He was a real peacemaker. He had done 27 years at the time we got him out. I was in that case. Gary Cartwright called me one day and he says, I've got this case, and he was telling me about it. Of course, I remembered who it was. And I agreed to get in it with him. And so we worked on that case for 9 or 10 years. We got him approved for parole 3 separate times. It'd be printed. It was great media on the case, a lot of media. And Gary was with me all the time. We even had a warden of one of the prison units go with us to the parole board to preach on behalf of the justified parole of Mr. Ott. A lot of media pressure on that board in that case. Each of those 3 times, the board withdrew their favorable vote before his parole day. They rescinded their vote. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. We knew it was political. But it was the Texas Rangers organizing through the governor's office, I suspect, and having that matter done. Finally, Gary wrote another blistering article about the injustice that was occurring due to political pressure on the parole board. And as much as I think we currently have pretty honest and pretty straight, as a matter of fact, probably the best parole board members as we've had in years right now, but and it wasn't those members that necessarily voted for or against Greg Hawke. But finally we got a favorable vote, and then no date was set. No vote was posted. They didn't say if they voted for him or against him. Gary's article had triggered the interest of the national press. We had the woman that had been a judge in Dallas that later became a TV news courtroom commentator. Her name slips my mind right now, but she had us on her show several times. She contacted the fellow that does America's Most Wanted. We even had him on our side and interceding. And that brought enough pressure on the parole board from the other side and against the Texas Rangers where they backed off. And one day, about 6 months after we had appeared before the parole board without a vote, we get a call from one of the top dogs at the prison. And he says, if we let Greg Ott out on parole tomorrow, can you have him out of this state by 2 o'clock in the afternoon? Well, he was going to parole to Florida, so that was not a problem. So we went down, picked him up, bought him some clothes, put him on a plane and sent him back to Florida, and he's done wonderfully well. This is a terribly intelligent man who's been quite successful. So that was a major win that Gary and the one good thing that happened other than Ott getting released is during that 10-year period of time, my wife and I became quite good friends with Gary Cartwright and his wife, and we took some trips together, and I have the greatest respect for Gary. But the point is, the media helped me turn that case around.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
And if it hadn't been for the involvement in the media to help us turn it around, I don't think he would be out today.
And of course, John Boz was both hurt and helped by the media, mostly hurt.
John Boz was one of 10 young men who grew up in a privileged area of Houston called the Woodlands. Most of the families of these 10 guys were upper middle class. One of them was the son of the assistant superintendent of schools out in that area. And John's smart kid, all of them were smart kids. It became rather personal because my stepson went to school with these guys. Mm-hmm. And some of them I'd known. Some of them had been guests in our lake house and gone skiing with my kid. And I knew they weren't what the media presented them to be. They were down in the Montrose area of Houston, which at the time was it still is, a gathering place and a primary residence area for many of folks in the Gray community in Houston. Matter of fact, my wife and I live down in that area, though we're not a member of their clan. And they were out one night in high school, cruising the bars down there. They were probably, some of them were engaged in going into the bars and selling some drugs. But they were messed up that night. And about 2 in the morning, as the clubs were closing down, they were driving around an area in the club area of Montrose. And 2 fellows were walking back from clubbing. One of them was a banker, and the other was his buddy. And these 2 cars of guys drive up. Now they're intoxicated. They're messed up. And I don't think there's any doubt that while what happened was depicted as a hate crime, it was nothing but a bunch of young adults in their teen years acting as though what I call a teenage pack mentality. They jumped out, they were going to start a ruckus. One of the kids pulled out a very sharp knife and stuck the deceased, causing a fairly minor injury at the time. It was a holiday weekend, and it was in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and the emergency facilities of the ambulance service weren't too interested in jumping out there and picking this guy up. He asked to be taken to a Catholic hospital. He was a Catholic. At that hospital, the hospital he went to, while we have 2 Type A #1 trauma centers in Houston, he went to one that wasn't. To make a long story short, John Boz was the last of those to be sentenced, and he got a 45-year sentence.
He pled to 45.
None of this was tried. As near as I can tell, and I may be wrong, but our research has shown, nobody got a hold of the autopsy report to look at it or to have a doctor review it. After we got in the case, we got the autopsy report. We had 2 experts, one in Canada and one in the United States, review it. And they said it wasn't the knife that killed him, though it was the instigating factor. Mm-hmm. It was that he bled to death because they didn't follow the proper procedures in the emergency room. And we worked with the Boz. We were in that case for 8 years with a fellow named Ray Hill, who is a prison and gay activist in Houston, a great guy. And Ray determined he was going to make this case because nobody knew who these boys were. And he got on TV, he is a great media advocate, and said this was a hate crime. That was the day after the incident. The media never checked their facts. They never went forward to investigate or to fact check what went on. The long and the short of it was media picked up that it was a hate crime, and from that point forward, in the minds of the gay community, in the minds of the Houston community, and in the minds of government officials, this was a horrible hate crime. In the interim, the city had a victim's advocate get involved who was just outlandish in some of the things he accused the guy of, and he was on the media every night. We weren't getting anywhere after 7 or 8 years, and lo and behold, a woman named Allison Armstrong, who had been a well-respected Canadian Broadcasting Company documentary filmmaker, came to Houston and got interested in this case and financed it herself. She had made some other documentaries that had made some waves. She was a well-respected person. She got involved in investigating the matters, and not only did she find what we had found, but she also had come up with things we didn't know about from some of the other witnesses. And everybody was out of prison except John. And they continued the great political pressure. All of the Houston delegation to the Austin legislature, the city management and mayors, they were all just media wild to keep John Boz in prison.
Well, again, you had a model prisoner. John was a model prisoner, and the parole board wanted to parole him, but the political heat came on, they reversed themselves.
They could not deal with the political realities they faced, and their fear was, in Texas, during this period of time, if you're appointed to the parole board, you serve at the pleasure of the governor. Now, if you were appointed to be a district judge in this state, and you issued an opinion from the bench that the governor who appointed you didn't like, what kind of court system would we have if the governor can reach up and pull you off the bench? Well, that's the kind of situation that the parole board faces in this state. Now, in many states, governors can veto a parole decision, but here they'll just fire you. Now, I haven't seen it done, but it can be done, and everybody knows it. So, at any rate, John had attained his master's degree while in prison, a great student, just like Greg Hawke, just been an exceptional inmate, and had the most level head. He and Greg Hawke both had developed the most level approach to life that I have ever seen. The sun came up on the same side of the same building every day in his world. And he would take these denials much better than I did as his lawyer for 8 years. Finally, Ray Hill had gotten me in this after he had realized what had happened and that he had misled the press by saying this was a hate crime. And ultimately, when Allison Armstrong finished her documentary, which, by the way, this year has been released and has won several film festivals, it's won Best Film at several at the Miami Gay Film Festival, at the Atlanta Gay Film Festival, and she's won some other awards for it. It's called The Guy with a Knife. And once that, we gave the parole board a pre-release copy of that, saying this is going to be released. Amazingly, after they saw that film, John was paroled. He's out now, doing fine. You're not seeing any more problems out of John Boz. And of course, Mike, you had a hand in that too, with some of your writing and some of your comments about it. But those were the two longest I think I've been involved in. And it's interesting to note that in my work, be it cases that we've engaged in trial in or some certain parole cases like this, it's never the case that comes in and hires you that seemingly is the one that you get the publicity on or that turns into one of those things you just can't put down. Mm-hmm. It's always a surprise, and it's always demanding, and you reach a degree of frustration, but ultimately a great deal of joy when you're able to help someone like it.
Well, one of your great successes, and this is maybe one of the most recent ones too, is the parole board characterizing sex offenders without due process. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, these were a series of cases I did with my dear friend Richard Gladden from Denton, Texas, who I just think the world of. I hadn't done civil rights cases in a number of years. And the Texas Parole Board was paroling persons who did not have a sex offense on their record. They'd never been convicted of a sex offense. But they may have had an arrest for a sex offense, and then maybe they charged the wrong guy, or some reason the plea got reduced to something that wasn't a sex offense for some reason. But at any rate, there was no conviction for a sex offense. And if they found a hickey that implied a sexual element in the history, once these people were out, they would send them a letter. And they would say, "We've reviewed your file. You've got 30 days to write us a letter and tell us why we shouldn't put you on sex offender supervision and send you off to sex school." There was a case called Coleman versus Dredke, the Fifth Circuit had issued opinions on, that said that to label someone a sex offender is to impose a social stigmatization on them that requires, before you can do that, if they've not been convicted of a sex offense, the imposing agency should be required to give a full-blown due process hearing. It actually turned out to be a minimal due process hearing with the same rights as you had in a parole revocation hearing. And the parole board just refused to do it. Part of the problem with this is that a lot of the inmates who got out, they may have a GED, but they couldn't write a paragraph to defend themselves if they had to. The parole board was not giving these people the evaluations that their sex therapists were doing on these people before they imposed these conditions on them. And we couldn't find anybody who had successfully defended themselves. So I had semi-retired at that time. I'd long since come back. I didn't like retirement much. But one day I just got fed up with it. And I called Richard and I said, "Look, I hadn't done a civil rights case and I don't know when. I used to do a lot of them. But why don't you and I do this thing? I've got somebody here that can pay us enough money that I thought would cover our expenses to get into it. We'll file it over in Austin and off we go." About that time, Jim Harrington, who had with the civil rights group here in Austin, had also filed one. And Jim's went to trial about 2 weeks before ours did, and then ours went to trial. And there were some, I forget how many, it's over 7,000 people at one time, I believe the testimony was, that were anticipated to be placed on this sex offender supervision conditions, Condition X as it's known, without any meaningful due process. So we had a trial that went on, and the one I remember that was the most interesting one was in I forget the name of the judge in Austin, but I had a high regard for him. The case went on for several weeks, and we won the case. And during the course of this, the jury originally granted us $27,000 in damages personally against the chairman of the parole board, which you just don't see happen anymore. They got that later reversed, but we prevailed, and they now have to give hearings to all of these people. The number of people they are now accusing of putting into this program has dropped substantially. They reduced, 800-900 people they had to take off of sex supervision because they decided they didn't want to give them a hearing. And we're still looking for a case where they are continuing to interfere. If someone is convicted of a sex offense and it doesn't involve a child, and this person is the parent of children, they still are interfering with the right to possession and access to living with those children. And we had one of those cases we tried over Judge Sparks. That was whose court we were in, Judge Sparks, the great judge. We have that issue that we're looking for. We had one that went on through discovery for about a year, just a bloody thing. And the day we were about to put our first witness on, the Attorney General stood up and said, we're going to give them everything they want. He can have access to his child. Go on and do it. But I don't think the parole board has any authority to terminate or interfere with a parent-child relationship without due process. Certainly the family code is very prohibitive of that. But those are some of the civil rights cases we've got.
Well, let's go back in time a little bit. I know...
Let me interrupt right quick.
Okay.
We got 10 minutes worth of tape or whatever you call it left. We may be able to do something later, but right now that's about.
All right, can you give us about 2 minute notice toward the end? Okay, that'd be fine.
So let's go back. I know one of the things that shaped your life and your career, you were an aspiring musician. You are a musician, but your father went to prison and came out a broken man on a white-collar crime.
Well,
did that shape you, do you think?
Well, it certainly had an impact on me, and I realized more and more how large an impact it had. My dad and I were close, and he was an insurance adjuster. My mother was a college professor. My brother's a retired senior vice president with Walmart. I come from a pretty middle-class family. Dad had a gambling habit and was involved in a deal where he fell south of the law and got a 3-year sentence. Never thought it would happen in our family, so that gives me some real empathy for those I'm dealing with. Mm-hmm. And he was paroled and pardoned before I ever thought about being a lawyer. Mm-hmm. Now, he wound up being a business manager for a large nonprofit, and he lived that out the rest of his life, and he was reasonably successful, and we regained our relationship, of course. But yes, that had an impact. As to the musician aspect, I'm absolutely shocked and amazed to find today I'm a lawyer. That I knew what I wanted to do in the 9th grade, and lawyer wasn't on the list. That didn't happen to me till I was about 27 or 26 when I decided I might think about that. But I started taking private music theory lessons in the 9th grade and continued taking them from a music professor out at the college where I lived. I auditioned for the North Texas Lab Band as a senior in high school. I was one of the freshmen that made that band, which was a wonderful experience. I dropped out of school and went on the road with several big-name bands. I worked with Sonny and Cher and Glenn Campbell and most of the stage shows from Vegas that were out on the road at that time. I worked with the ice shows. I worked with the big bands and small groups, had my own small group for a number. I quit playing about 2007. But it's something I always enjoyed doing. When I opened my own office, I played my secretary's salary with the money I was making off playing in big bands in Houston. And it's while in Houston and after I was a lawyer, I was playing with a big band there that was the National Football League was having the Lombardi Awards televised that year, and I was working that show. And about 2 hours before the show, the guy that was to conduct it had a car wreck. And I was pulled out of the pit and got to conduct a national TV show, so I was pretty excited about that. But I've always enjoyed, my intention in life, and I was a music major, was to be a composer and conductor and player, and I wanted to write scores for Hollywood films and for contemporary dance groups.
If I had time, I'd still think about doing some of it, but I did a lot of writing and composing.
So let's talk a little bit, just briefly, about the Ruiz case, because it foreshadows the Eire Brown. But you testified in Ruiz, and
If just real quickly, if you go read Judge Justice's opinion about the section under the Sixth Amendment of an inmate's access to courts and counsel, that came right out of my testimony. And I had a great admiration for Judge Justice.
this was where the inmates, the lawyer would hand the guard the legal papers, the guard would copy it and then give it to the inmate.
In those days, there was no slot to pass documents through. You'd hand your documents to the guard. 10 or 15 minutes later, they'd show up on the other side of the screen. And no doubt that in some instances, if you were suing them, that they'd Xerox those things, or I certainly suspect they would. And so Judge Justices had the slot put in, and for many years, if you really wanted to piss off the prison officials, you call them Habern holes.
The Habern hole.
And they still get upset when they hear that.
So you want to stop me?
Well, let's talk a minute about Eire.
Well, I wanted to change tape.
No, we're still okay.
No, that's it.
All right. So one morning in April '81, you hear or you read the paper about the murders, the deaths of 2 prison officials at LSU.
Yeah, there was a young inmate named Eire Brown, had horrible growth condition. Anyway, I got appointed. We put a defense team together that consisted of myself, Tim Sloan, Craig Washington, and at the time our investigator was Kent Schaefer, who later came into the case. There were 3 trials on the 2 murders. First one was 11-1 for not guilty. The next 2 were not guilties. You wrote the book, The Trials of Eire Brown, which is published by the University of Texas Press, that I would urge you to read if you haven't. That was a case that had quite an impact on TDC and certainly had a major impact on my life. I had never tried a more contentious case in my life. Craig Washington is one of the best stand-up, shoot-from-the-hip lawyers I've ever worked with. And the only more contentious case I can think of is the one we did recently with the parole board over the sex offender issue.
Well, it helped that you knew what was going on in prisons, that in some sense, Eire was a replay of Ruiz.
It was exactly a replay of Ruiz. I had followed the Ruiz closely. I had worked with the government in putting that case together. And my job was to deal with the prison issues in the Eire Brown case, and we were successful in our defense of him and in the follow-up civil rights case that we won.
He won these cases by theory of self-defense.
That's correct.
The warden pulled a gun on Eire. He knocked it down. There was a wrestling match. The farm major was shot in the head. He drowned the warden and testified to that effect.
No doubt about it. Forensics didn't exactly support him, but it was a most exciting time in my life, and certainly got my career up and running. And I wish more lawyers would become more interested in prison-related issues, and it's very important.
And I guess one of the last great things that happened was Eire got paroled finally.
Eire's got paroled. He's living in the Waco area and doing just fine.
He was in parole. He was back in prison for a robbery he did after he was acquitted when he got back on heroin.
That's correct. Yeah. But Eire's doing fine.
Yeah.
Well, on behalf of TCDLA, thank you very much, Mr. Habern.
But
my personal behalf, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure to be here
out
and an honor, and I appreciate TCDLA and all it's done for me.